What does it mean when a civilization remembers how to reach for the stars, yet forgets how it got there? History is often told as a staircase, each century rising above the last, each invention neatly replacing what came before. But the deeper you look, the less orderly that staircase appears. It begins to resemble something older, stranger, and more human. A shoreline, after the tide has gone out, scattered with fragments of brilliance half buried in sand. A gear where no machine should be. A wall that refuses to fall. A metal that does not rust. A formula that vanishes with the hands that once knew it. Across deserts, mountains, coastlines, and ruined cities, the ancient world left behind objects that feel less like relics and more like questions. Not proof of magic, not evidence of fantasy. Something far more unsettling than either. Proof that human knowledge has always been uneven, fragile, and easier to lose than we like to admit. We tend to imagine our ancestors as distant and dimly lit, standing at the beginning of a long road that leads, somehow, to us. But these artifacts suggest another possibility. Perhaps they were not standing only at the beginning. Perhaps in certain moments, they stood at summits we no longer fully understand. And perhaps what disappeared was not just technique, but whole ways of seeing the world. This is not a story about impossible machines or secret histories. It is a story about memory, about skill, about the quiet tragedy of knowledge that can survive in stone, in glass, in iron, and still vanish from the human mind. Because every civilization leaves behind monuments. The rarer thing is a map explaining how they were made. And so we begin where many great mysteries begin. Not with certainty, but with a surviving fragment and the uneasy feeling that the past may have known more than it was able to keep. It began, as many enduring mysteries do, with something small enough to fit in a hand. In 1901, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera descended into a shipwreck resting in dim water and drifting silt. They expected statues, coins, the usual cargo of a lost world. What they found, instead, looked almost unremarkable at first, a corroded lump of bronze and wood, cracked by centuries underwater, its surface crusted with salt and time. It could easily have been discarded as debris from the wreck, but inside that ruined mass, hidden beneath decay, were gears. Gears should not have been there, not like this. When scholars began to study the object, they realized they were looking at a machine of astonishing intricacy, built more than 2,000 years ago. Dozens of interlocking bronze wheels had once turned together in careful relation, tracking celestial cycles with a precision that seemed out of place in the ancient world. It was not merely a tool, it was a way of thinking made visible in metal. The device, now known as the Antikythera Mechanism, appears to have modeled the movements of the sun, the moon, eclipses, and perhaps even the known planets. It translated the heavens into motion a person could hold, rotate, and consult. In a culture that watched the sky not only for wonder, but for agriculture, ritual, and navigation, this machine became something almost poetic, a bridge between human hands and cosmic order. And yet what haunts historians is not only what it did, but how alone it seems. Nothing else like it survived from the ancient Mediterranean in such sophistication. It stands in the historical record like a solitary note from a vanished symphony, suggesting traditions of craftsmanship, mathematics, and engineering that may have existed more widely, then disappeared. Maybe that is what makes it feel so modern. It reminds us that progress is not a straight line. Sometimes a civilization reaches an exquisite understanding, and then the thread breaks. A machine sinks, a workshop closes, a language changes, a world ends. And somewhere in the silence that follows, the stars continue moving exactly as before, while the knowledge of how to measure them waits in darkness to be found again. What if the strongest things human beings build are not always the newest, but the ones that learn to live with time? Along the coast of Italy, where sea spray settles onto stone and the earth has trembled for millennia, stand structures the Roman Empire should not have been able to give us so completely. Harbors, aqueducts, domes, breakwaters, many of them damaged, weathered, repaired, and still here. Modern concrete, for all its convenience, often cracks and weakens within decades. Yet Roman concrete, poured in an age without electric mixers or industrial chemistry, has in some cases endured for 2,000 years. Its secret was not a miracle, it was attention. Roman builders mixed volcanic ash, lime, and fragments of rock into a material that did something rare. It changed over time without simply collapsing. In seawalls and marine structures especially, contact with salt water appears to have triggered chemical reactions that strengthen the material, allowing crystals to grow within tiny fractures, rather than letting those fractures spread unchecked. The concrete did not remain frozen in one perfect state. It adapted. That may be the most striking part. So much of modern engineering seeks control, uniformity, exact repetition. Roman concrete suggests another philosophy, one rooted in collaboration with place. Builders used the geology around them, especially the volcanic ash of regions near the Bay of Naples, and turned local earth into architecture that could tolerate centuries of pressure, wind, and tide. Their buildings were not immortal. They were simply made with an understanding of change. And somewhere along the way, that understanding was thinned out, altered, replaced. The empire fractured. Trade routes shifted. Techniques became regional, then partial, then obscure. What survived were the monuments, but not always the full chain of practice that made them possible. We inherited the shell of the achievement before we truly understood its chemistry. There is something deeply human in that loss. We leave behind bridges, walls, and names carved in stone, hoping they will speak for us. But materials carry memory differently than stories do. A structure can stand for ages, while the logic inside it falls silent. Perhaps that is why Roman concrete still feels less like a dead invention than a conversation interrupted. It asks whether durability comes not from resisting the world completely, but from knowing how to endure within it. What kind of people raise monuments before they build cities? On a windswept hill in southeastern Turkey, the earth once kept a secret for thousands of years. Beneath the soil lay circles of towering stone pillars, some taller than a person, carved with foxes, vultures, snakes, boars, and abstract marks that still seem to hover between art and language. Long before the pyramids, long before Stonehenge, long before pottery was common, or metal, or anything we comfortably associate with civilization, human beings gathered here and made something immense. Today, we call the site Göbekli Tepe, but naming it does not solve it. The unsettling fact is not merely its age, though its age is enough to rearrange the mind. It is the level of intention. These enclosures were planned. The pillars were quarried, shaped, moved, and raised with a confidence that suggests coordination, memory, and shared purpose on a scale that should not, by older assumptions, have existed yet. For generations, many of us learned to imagine civilization beginning with necessity. First agriculture, then villages, then temples, then symbols, then organized belief. Göbekli Tepe hints at another order. Perhaps people first gathered around meaning. Perhaps ceremony came before settlement. Perhaps the need to stand together beneath something larger than daily survival helped create the very societies that would later farm, build, and write. That possibility changes more than a timeline. It changes the emotional picture of our ancestors. They were not simply struggling through prehistory in a haze of instinct. They were capable of abstraction, devotion, planning, and aesthetic power. They looked at stone and saw memory. They looked at the sky and felt compelled to answer it. And then, in one of history's quietest and strangest gestures, they buried the site themselves. Not abandoned it, buried it, carefully, deliberately, as though closing a door for reasons we can no longer hear. Maybe that is why Göbekli Tepe still feels so intimate despite its age. It does not just ask what ancient people could build. It asks what they believed was worth preserving, even from the future, and whether the first great human achievement was not survival alone, but shared wonder. How does a piece of metal become a legend? Imagine a blade lifted toward the sun. Across its surface, faint waves move through the steel like water disturbed by wind, dark and pale lines flowing together in a pattern that seems almost alive. For centuries, these blades were spoken of with a kind of reverence. Damascus steel was said to hold an edge of astonishing sharpness, to bend without breaking, to carry both beauty and force in the same narrow form. But what made it enduring was not only performance, it was the sense that human hands had learned how to persuade iron into something nearly poetic. The story stretches across regions and generations. The raw steel, likely born from crucibles in India, traveled through trade routes into the Islamic world, where smiths refined it into weapons and objects of great prestige. Heat, carbon, trace elements, timing, and the practiced eye of the craftsman all had to come into balance. Somewhere in that choreography, the metal developed a structure that modern science still studies with admiration. Even now, researchers can identify parts of what gave the blades their strength and their distinctive watered appearance, yet the complete method remains elusive. That is what makes Damascus steel more than a metallurgical curiosity. It represents a kind of knowledge that lived in touch, rhythm, and repetition. A master may never have written down every step because the final secret was not a sentence. It was judgment, the color of the glow, the feel of resistance beneath a hammer, the exact moment to stop. And when trade changed, ores shifted, workshops vanished, and lineages broke, that judgment disappeared with them. We inherited the myth, the fragments, the analyses under microscopes, but the living continuity was gone. Perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden in every lost craft. Knowledge does not vanish only when libraries burn. Sometimes it disappears when the last person who can feel the difference is no longer there to teach it. What do we really mean when we call a place lost? High in the Andes, where clouds drag their shadows across steep green ridges, the stones of Machu Picchu hold morning light with an almost unreal calm. The city appears gradually, not as a ruin exploding from the jungle, but as a geometry of patience, terraces following the mountain's body, stairways climbing into mist, walls fitted so precisely that even now a blade can barely slip between the stones. It looks less built upon the landscape than negotiated with it. For generations, people have marveled at that precision. Massive granite blocks were shaped and set without mortar, aligned with such care that the structures have endured earthquakes that would have shattered less thoughtful designs. The Inca did not simply impose architecture on a difficult environment. They studied the slopes, the water, the forces beneath the ground. Channels directed rain. Terraces stabilized the earth. Temples and homes were arranged with a sensitivity to both function and ceremony, as if practicality and reverence belonged to the same language. That is part of the wonder of Machu Picchu. It resists the old habit of treating ancient engineering and spiritual life as separate things. Here, astronomy, agriculture, governance, and ritual seem to meet in stone. The city may have served as an estate, a sanctuary, or something that changed over time. The truth remains debated. But whatever its exact role, it was clearly shaped by a worldview in which human settlement was meant to converse with mountain, sky, and season. And yet even this place, so carefully made, entered a kind of silence, not erased from local memory, as the old myths sometimes suggested, but largely hidden from the global historical imagination until the modern era fixed its gaze upon it. The site became famous as a rediscovery, though for nearby communities the mountains had never truly forgotten it. Maybe that is the lesson concealed in those fitted stones. A place can be hidden without being absent. Knowledge can persist at the edges of empire, outside the narratives that later declare it missing. And sometimes what we call discovery says as much about our own blindness as it does about the past itself. What survives longer, the object itself or the idea hidden inside it? In museum cases and archaeological reports, there are moments when the ancient world seems to lean unexpectedly close. A delicate bead catches the light. A polished surface returns a face. A shard of color remains so vivid it feels newly made. Among the most haunting of these survivals is ancient glass, fragile, translucent, and strangely intimate. Unlike stone, it does not promise permanence. It breaks, it clouds, it slips easily back into fragments. And yet some ancient glass objects carry a sophistication that still feels startling. Roman craftsmen learned to shape glass with remarkable fluency, refining techniques of blowing, casting, and coloring that allowed vessels, windows, and decorative objects to travel across a vast empire. In some cases, they produced forms so thin and elegant they seem to challenge our assumptions about ancient industry. Lycurgus Cup-like effects, layered cameo glass, intricate mosaics of color fused in heat. These were not accidents of decoration. They reveal experimentation, controlled temperatures, and an eye trained to work at the edge between chemistry and art. What makes ancient glass so compelling is that it lives in contradiction. It appears delicate, yet it carries hard knowledge. Sand, minerals, ash, furnace design, timing, cooling, each element had to be understood not only in theory, but in practice. Too much heat, and the piece collapses. Too little, and it never becomes what it could be. In that sense, glass is a record of discipline disguised as beauty. And like so many ancient achievements, its story is uneven. Some methods spread. Others narrowed into regional specialties. Some were rediscovered centuries later, not because the material vanished, but because the chain of skill weakened. The furnace can be rebuilt. The ingredients can be listed. What takes longer to recover is the quiet confidence of the hand that knows exactly when the glowing mass is ready. Perhaps that is why glass feels like such a powerful metaphor for civilization itself. We are transparent only in fragments. We shine, we fracture, we preserve traces of fire. And sometimes the most revealing things our ancestors left behind are the ones that seem, at first glance, too delicate to last. What if the ancient world learned to manipulate light in ways it could never fully explain? In a museum gallery, Behind careful glass and controlled air, there sits a Roman cup that seems to change its mind. Viewed one way, it glows a muted green. Illuminate it from within, and it turns a deep, luminous red, as though the object were carrying two identities at once. The Lycurgus Cup is not large. It does not overwhelm with scale. Its power lies in something quieter, the unsettling realization that artisans of the 4th century created an optical effect that feels almost modern. For a long time, it seemed like an elegant curiosity, a beautiful accident in colored glass. But closer study revealed something far more remarkable. Embedded within the material are tiny particles of gold and silver, so small they interact with light in highly specific ways. Today, we would describe this through the language of nanotechnology. The Romans, of course, had no such term. Yet somehow, through heat, materials, and disciplined craft, they produced an object whose color shifts according to how light passes through it. That does not mean they possessed modern science in disguise. More likely, they possessed something equally impressive, a workshop tradition refined through patience, experiment, and a sensitivity to matter that could achieve extraordinary results without fully formalizing the theory behind them. Someone learned what mixture worked. Someone learned what furnace conditions mattered. Someone knew when the glass had become exactly what it needed to be. And then, as with so many ancient achievements, the continuity frayed. The empire weakened. Workshops disappeared. Techniques narrowed into fragments and memory. What remained was the object itself, brilliant and silent, surviving long after the explanations were gone. Perhaps that is the deeper wonder of the Lycurgus Cup. It reminds us that human beings often discover beauty before they discover the language to describe it. And sometimes the hand arrives at truths that the mind will only understand centuries later. How do you build for an earthquake before you can explain an earthquake? Above Cusco, where the mountains hold both silence and weather, the walls of Sacsayhuamán rise like a test no century has managed to erase. At first glance, they seem almost impossible in their simplicity. Enormous stones, stacked without mortar, each one shaped into an irregular geometry that should resist order and somehow becomes it. Stand close, and the effect is even stranger. The seams are so fine they nearly vanish. The mass is overwhelming, but the fit feels intimate, as though each block had learned the shape of its neighbors by touch. The Inca achieved something here that still unsettles engineers. Many of these stones weighed tens of tons, some far more. They were quarried, moved across difficult terrain, lifted into place, and fitted into complex polygonal patterns with extraordinary precision. And the result was not merely beautiful, it was resilient. When earthquakes shook the region, later colonial buildings cracked and collapsed, while these walls shifted, absorbed the force, and settled back into themselves. That adaptability may be the true genius of the design. Instead of fighting the earth with rigid symmetry, the builders created a form of order, flexible enough to move. Every stone is different. Every angle matters. The wall behaves less like a stack of blocks than like a living system of pressure, balance, and release. It is architecture shaped by listening. What we do not fully understand is how such precision was achieved with the tools we know the Inca possessed. Stone hammers, abrasion, patience, coordination. These certainly played a role. But the leap from possibility to accomplishment remains immense. Not because ancient people were incapable, but because we still underestimate what disciplined knowledge can do without leaving behind a manual. And maybe that is the quiet power of Sacsayhuamán. It reminds us that intelligence is not always loud, theoretical, or written down. Sometimes it survives as a wall that remains standing long after the explanations have fallen away. Why do some monuments feel less like buildings than conversations with the sky? Across the Yucatan, where the heat rises from stone and the jungle presses close around abandoned plazas, the Maya left behind cities shaped by mathematics, ceremony, and attention to time itself. Their temples still climb above the trees in deliberate lines, each stair and platform carrying the weight of both engineering and belief. To stand before them is to feel that architecture here was never only about shelter or power. It was about alignment between earth and season, ruler and ritual, human life and the turning heavens. At sites like Chichen Itza, that relationship becomes especially vivid. The pyramid known as El Castillo is often discussed for its precision, its terraces, stairways, and symbolic numbers, its connection to calendrical cycles, its famous interplay with light and shadow during the equinoxes. As the sun lowers, the edges of the structure can create the illusion of a serpent descending the staircase, a moment where astronomy becomes image and stone seems to move without moving at all. Whether every detail of that effect was planned exactly as modern retellings suggest is still debated. But the broader truth remains. The Maya built with a profound awareness of celestial rhythm. This was not isolated wonder. It was part of a larger intellectual world that tracked planetary cycles, developed intricate calendars, and tied observation to agriculture, ceremony, and political life. Their knowledge of the sky was not separate from daily existence. It organized memory, it shaped decisions, it gave pattern to uncertainty. And yet, as always, what survives is only part of the whole. The cities remain in fragments. The inscriptions speak, but not completely. The observing minds that once stood on these platforms at dusk are gone, leaving us the architecture of attention, but not the full interior of thought that animated it. Perhaps that is why Maya monuments still feel so haunting. They remind us that human beings have long searched for meaning by watching the same sky we see now. The stars have not changed, but every civilization arranges its questions differently, hoping for a moment when light, shadow, and time briefly make sense together. What does it mean for iron to outlive the rain? In Delhi, under an open sky that has carried monsoon after monsoon across the centuries, there stands a pillar that seems to have made a private agreement with time. It is tall, spare, almost modest at first glance. No elaborate ornament, no theatrical scale, and yet the closer you come, the stranger it becomes. This is iron more than 1,600 years old, exposed to heat, humidity, dust, touch, and air, and still it has resisted the corrosion that should have claimed it long ago. The Iron Pillar of Delhi was forged during the Gupta period, likely in the 4th or 5th century, when metalworkers in the Indian subcontinent were already capable of feats that deserve far more admiration than they often receive. The pillar weighs several tons and was not cast in a single effortless act. It was shaped through repeated heating, hammering, and welding of iron blooms, requiring both temperature control and collective discipline on a scale that still impresses metallurgists today. Its survival is linked in part to chemistry, unusually pure iron, significant phosphorus content, and the gradual formation of a thin protective layer that shields the surface from deeper decay. But explanation does not erase wonder. Knowing the outline of the process only sharpens the question of mastery. How did ancient smiths coordinate such heat? How did they maintain consistency across so large a mass? How many failures preceded the success we now call extraordinary? The pillar suggests a culture of experimentation, memory, and technical judgment so refined that its final product appears almost effortless, which is often how true skill looks after centuries have forgotten the labor behind it. That, perhaps, is the real mystery. Not that the pillar is impossible, but that our habits of history so often underestimate the worlds that made such things. We inherit the object and call it remarkable. Those who created it may simply have called it work. And still it stands, season after season, carrying a quiet lesson. Endurance is not always loud. Sometimes it takes the form of a surface that does not yield, and a knowledge so well made that even rust struggles to undo it. What happens when a city disappears, but its ability to manage water does not? In the dry valleys and coastal deserts of the ancient world, survival was never only a matter of finding water. It was a matter of understanding how water moves when it is scarce, seasonal, or hidden beneath the ground. Few civilizations grasped that challenge more elegantly than the Nabateans, whose city of Petra still glows rose-red from the Jordanian stone. Visitors often remember the carved facades first, the tombs, the treasury, the drama of architecture emerging from canyon walls. But the deeper achievement may have been less visible. Petra was, among many other things, a hydraulic masterpiece. This was a city built in a harsh landscape, vulnerable to both drought and sudden flash floods. To endure there required more than wells and luck. The Nabateans engineered channels, cisterns, dams, conduits, and storage systems that captured seasonal rains, diverted dangerous surges, and preserved precious water for daily life. They carved pathways into rock, lined channels with waterproof plaster, and shaped the surrounding terrain into an ally rather than an obstacle. In a place where water could vanish or destroy with equal force, they learned to direct it with unusual precision. That practical intelligence supported more than mere endurance. It made urban life possible. Gardens, trade, ritual, rest, and movement through the city all depended on a system that turned environmental volatility into relative stability. Petra's beauty, in that sense, rested upon invisible discipline. The stone facades may draw the eye, but the waterworks reveal the mind behind them. And like so many ancient achievements, the system invites both admiration and humility. Parts of it can still be traced, studied, even restored in concept. Yet the full living knowledge, the maintenance routines, the seasonal judgments, the local intuition about storm and runoff belong to people whose world eventually changed beyond recognition. Trade routes shifted. Empires rose and fell. The city's centrality faded. The rock remained, but the habits that sustained it grew quiet. Maybe that is why Petra continues to feel so moving. It reminds us that civilization is not only sculpture, ceremony, or monument. It is also the hidden labor of keeping life possible in difficult places. And sometimes the greatest ancient technology is not the one that dazzles us first, but the one that let a city breathe. What if the oldest technology in this story is also the one we understand least honestly? Long before gears, pillars, blades, and cities, there was the simple human act of marking the world. A hand pressed against rock, a line of pigment drawn in torchlight, the curve of an animal caught in motion across a cave wall. These images remain among the earliest surviving records of the human mind, and yet they still resist easy explanation. We can describe the minerals in the paint, date the charcoal, map the chambers, and trace the outlines with extraordinary care. But the deeper question stays open. What were these painters trying to preserve? In caves across Europe, Indonesia, and beyond, ancient art appears with a confidence that feels unmistakably modern. Bison surge across stone. Horses seem to move in the flicker of firelight. Abstract marks repeat in patterns that may have meant counting, memory, ritual, or something now beyond recovery. The painters used the contours of rock to suggest muscle and breath. They chose depth, shadow, and placement with intention. This was not idle decoration in the margins of survival. It was thought made visible. That matters because it unsettles one of our oldest assumptions, that sophistication belongs mainly to later societies. Cave art reminds us that symbolic intelligence is ancient, emotional, and already deeply formed at the edge of prehistory. Whoever made these images possessed not only observation, but imagination, the ability to look at the world and then remake it in a space set apart from ordinary life. Whether the art served ceremony, storytelling, teaching, or a union of many purposes, it points to minds already wrestling with absence, presence, fear, wonder, and memory. And perhaps that is why these painted chambers feel so intimate. They are not just evidence of artistic skill, they are evidence of interior life. Someone stood in darkness and felt compelled to leave a sign that said, in effect, "We were here. We saw this. It mattered." In the end, that may be the hidden thread connecting every ancient technology. Each one is a way of resisting disappearance. A machine maps the stars. A wall absorbs the earth's trembling. A blade holds a vanished craft. A painting keeps a moment alive beyond the life that made it. And behind them all is the same fragile hope that what we know and what we feel might survive us a little while longer. In the end, the mystery is not that ancient people created remarkable things. The mystery is how often we forget they were people very much like us, curious, disciplined, imaginative, and vulnerable to loss. We began with the comforting illusion that history moves cleanly forward, that knowledge accumulates like light at dawn and never truly dims. But the record left behind tells a gentler, more unsettling story. Human understanding does not rise in a single line. It gathers in clusters. It flares in certain places. It depends on memory, materials, teachers, trade, peace, luck. And when those conditions break, even brilliant knowledge can fade, leaving only its results behind. That is what these ancient technologies reveal so powerfully. The Antikythera Mechanism shows a cosmos translated into bronze. Roman concrete teaches endurance through adaptation. Göbekli Tepe suggests that meaning itself may have helped build society. Damascus Steel carries the memory of touch. Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuamán turn stone into dialogue with mountain and motion. Maya monuments align earth with sky. The iron pillar resists decay with quiet confidence. Petra survives as an argument for hidden systems. Cave art reminds us that even our earliest ancestors wanted more than survival. They wanted to leave a trace of thought. None of this asks us to romanticize the past. Ancient people lived with hardship, hierarchy, uncertainty, and limits we would never choose. But they also possessed capacities that deserve more than condescension. They observed patiently. They worked collectively. They refined methods over generations. They built not only for use, but for meaning. In that sense, their greatest achievement may not have been technological at all. It may have been the human ability to bind skill, imagination, and belief into something that could outlast a lifetime. And perhaps that is where this story finally meets us. We live in an age of immense knowledge, yet also of distraction, fragility, and forgetting. We store more information than any civilization before us, but storage is not the same as wisdom, and access is not the same as understanding. The ancient world whispers a caution, as well as a comfort. What matters most can still be lost, even when it seems secure. So maybe the true legacy of these long-ago inventions is not a set of unsolved puzzles, but a different way of seeing ourselves. We are not the final chapter of intelligence, standing above the past in perfect clarity. We are another brief generation trying to preserve what we know, trying to pass on what we love, trying to make something durable against time. And somewhere, centuries from now, others may look at what we leave behind and wonder not only how we built it, but whether we understood what it was for. That may be the most human question of all, not how to conquer time, but how to speak through it.